Power armor. It's basically the mascot of Fallout, or one of them. It's simultaneously incredibly rare and found on every second street corner. Naturally, the overuse of power armor in the series causes conflicting lore, such as the infinite use armor locked behind specialized training in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, turning into the consumable powered suits accessible from level 1 in Fallout 4 and 76, or the T-51 being considered the pinnacle of pre-war power armor until Fallout 4 introduced the T-60. I intend to cover every single retcon and lore break related to power armor in the entire series and explain it plausibly within the game universe. To make it easier, here's a handy chart of the contents in the video. I've tried to order power armor suits by in-universe chronology, but as you'll see, it may not be perfect. And I'll only be covering what's generally considered to be canon, so only from the main games, and in 76's case, no skins or paints. Only something that can be seen on an NPC in-game or crafted by the player. And obviously crafting like that is a gameplay feature. In-universe you would acquire it a different way. The first thing to start off with in a video like this is to understand what the state of pre-war America was like. By the time of the Great War in 2077, despite America's advancements in nuclear energy, it was a country drained by war, rife with political and social unrest. They had been engaged in a brutal resource war with China for 11 years, with power armor being one of their most important weapons throughout. Its progression to the T-51 model marking a turning point within the war. While many power armor suits would have been deployed to the war effort in Alaska and Asia, there were also plenty of stateside army units as well as those in annexed Canada supplied with the suits, where many saw use in riot control and peacekeeping as civil unrest and armed conflict continued all the way through the end of the world. This is where we see a great difference between the east and the west coast of the United States. What we see of the east coast, there is far less destruction and far more advanced technology. Power armor, energy weapons, and robots appear much more frequently than in the areas we've explored on the west coast. Obviously this is because Bethesda veered away from Fallout's original art style and dumbed down the games. But in universe, the East Coast simply seems to have more abundant, advanced technology compared to the West. While the East Coast bolstered their military units with power armor and employed these suits against the rampant civil unrest, the West Coast made far more use of combat armor. Military and police units were equipped with specialized riot gear similar to the armor that was being used by American forces in Asia. The post-apocalyptic United States also differs greatly in the level of nuclear destruction between both ends of the country. Not only is advanced technology scarcer in the West, but the destruction caused by the war is far greater as well, likely destroying much of the military technology present in the West anyway. The reason for the difference, I assume, is simply the distance of the United States from China. Well, it's nothing more than conjecture because Fallout's technology differs from ours and we know so little about the rest of the world. China may have been limited on their weapons that could reach the east coast of America. China likely employed their full nuclear triad on the United States west coast. As we can see from the switchboard in Fallout 4, on the morning of the Great War it seems China had submarines off the coast of California and high-altitude aircraft over the Bering Strait. While on the east coast, as with the Yanks in Boston's harbour, much of the destruction would be whatever the Chinese Navy could scrape together. We do see an aircraft-deployed nuke in Fallout 3, but considering America's offensive through Asia into mainland China, there should be very few land or air-deployed nukes that could reach the United States east coast. I also think it's because China favoured using biological weapons on the east coast instead. As we can see, over 200 years after the war, the denizens of these cities have such severe brain damage, they are barely able to build even the most pathetic of crap shacks. The only organised forces in the east coast are those that have come from the west. The only plausible explanation for this is that China employed special weaponry to ensure any survivors of the war were absolute morons. Now that we've got the establishing exposition out of the way, we can move on to the video proper. Starting with one of the biggest changes to power armor, the frame. In the classic games, power armor acts nearly the same as any other regular armor, equipping and unequipping, but notably making the character wearing it taller. Fallout 3 New Vegas again treat it very similar to regular armor, but do not make the character wearing it taller. With Fallout 4, power armor works drastically differently. Instead of carrying it around in your inventory and being able to slip it on like pajamas, you need a power armor frame, a permanent object in the world that can be entered and operated more like a vehicle, where the armor itself is separated into 6 components: the limbs, torso, and head, which are each equipped onto or unequipped from the frame for use. While being a drastic change to the gameplay function of power armor, it's quite easy to rectify in-universe. Since the original game, the T-51 has always had this hatch wheel on its back, suggesting it's more than just a suit you can slip on. The height increase furthers this point. You can also see an earlier version of the operator suit and frame concept in 3 New Vegas with the Recon armor. The reason that power armor looks so scrawny in 3 New Vegas is simply the gameplay limitations Bethesda had to work with at the time. Given the way they've made power armor work in their 2 latest games, we can assume that Bethesda is saying this is how it always worked. Except, in the Fallout TV show Season 2, we saw a T-45 in Alaska. Now, I've seen some people suggesting this doesn't have the same frame as the later models because the proportions are less stretched compared to the T-60. I'm not entirely convinced. The most likely answer here is that it's simply artistic liberties for the different prop suits. But suppose this is specifically meant to say the T-45 here does not have the same frame as the T-60. It doesn't mean the T-45 doesn't have a frame at all, it still has the same backhatch design. Rather, what's likely happening here is that the T-45 was built as a single complete suit, but with the production of a second model, the T-51, the design changed to modularity, where all future suits would be able to change out parts much easier for repair or replacement. It's at this point I need to go on a side tangent about the lettering system, as the T-51 was originally called the T-51B and the T-45 the T-45D. Fallout 4 retconned this to be that every power armor had numerous levels of upgrade potential that each coincided with a letter, but this retcon was walked back in Fallout 76 with all power armor being without any letter designation, save for the T-51 being permanently classified as the T-51B. This raises the potential that the T-45 Delta in the older games is actually a slightly different variant than the T-45 in the newer games. So this power armor we see in Alaska is actually the T-45 Delta, and all the modular T-45s we see were produced or upgraded after the deployment of the T-51. However, the same can't be said for the T-51 Bravo, as in Fallout 76, it clearly has the Fallout 4 design, and the Brotherhood Expeditionary Force in 76 seems to have brought their T-51s from Lost Hills. But if you really squint your eyes and look at it through chlorinated water, you can at least rectify the custom fitting of the T-51 mentioned in older games to be the fitting of the operator suit in tandem with the armor, because really, while using power armor, you should be wearing the operator suits like the Brotherhood. While you can get away with wearing regular clothes, anything more being a gameplay exception, in-universe, to get the most responsiveness and protection wearing the armor, you should be using the pilot suit, as it is clearly designed to interlink with the armor and insulate the wearer. The last thing about the frame is the fact that it removes all fall damage, and yeah, this one doesn't really make sense. It seemed like they were explaining it in the Fallout TV show with the thrusters, but then it turned into an Iron Man suit and none of it makes sense. We just have to assume it's not normally supposed to do that, and using the thrusters in that manner burned the fusion core out significantly faster, which brings us to the next matter: fusion cores. In Fallout 1 it was stated that the T-51 was powered by a TX-28 microfusion pack, but now all the power armor is powered by fusion cores, or rather, the frame is, with all the armor being interchangeable. You can speculate it may be a differing model of T-51 that uses the microfusion pack, but we see in the TV show that fusion cores have been used in power armor even before the T-51 was developed. Normally this would be a perfectly acceptable retcon, something minor has been changed to flesh it out and develop it further, but fusion cores fall short of this because the way they are implemented greatly damages power armor's presence in the Fallout world. These suits that have always been considered the pinnacle of pre-war military technology now only work for a few in-game hours before needing another recharge from a rare power source in a post-nuclear wasteland. Really, fusion cores acting this way can't be anything anything other than a gameplay feature. Not only would factions such as the Brotherhood or Enclave have to greatly limit their power armor use, the likes of the Atom Cats or simply Raiders could never hope to use power armor. How long they actually last is really just up to the specific rider in any given circumstance, but realistically they should be lasting a few weeks at least, if not hundreds of years. And I didn't know where else to put it, so I'll cover it here. The whole needing a key to use fusion cores as well as power armor locking when the core is removed, I think is just a Brotherhood modification to the armor and not standard. The next retcon we have to cover is power armor training. Exclusive to Fallout 3 and New Vegas, you are unable to use power armor until you receive specific training for it. None of the other games have this feature, however. It's easy to ignore in Fallout 1 and 2 because of how little power armor there is in those games. But in the modern games, and especially now the TV show, the number of people we see use power armor pretty much eliminates power armor training as a concept. At least such a literal one. Power armor is like any other machinery. Plenty of people will technically be able to use it, just not use it well. Guiding a full-ton suit of metal while walking on stilts is going to have a learning curve, which admittedly still isn't shown very much. On to the next retcon. The weird flip-up face mask thing they did in the TV show, both for the T-45 and the T-60. This retcon is very stupid. It's just a cheap Hollywood addition so they can show the actor's face. There's absolutely no practical reason for power armor helmets to do that, as it'll just make the gas mask seal and ballistic protection of the mask much more likely to fail. We really just have to hope this stays as an artistic choice for the TV show and does not make it to the games. Speaking of bad additions from the TV show, we have the brand recognition power armor. This isn't some other prototype model from before the war. You can see it's T-60 that's been modified. Now, how did the NCR come across working T-60 on the West Coast? There isn't any good reason. All you can say is they dug up a suit that was being sent to the West Coast before the war, and that's unfortunately what a lot of explanations come down to. Isolated and unlikely circumstances that continually happen. Let's wrap up the last miscellaneous retcon with power armor stats, or simply which one's better than which. I try ever so hard to make these make sense, but it's just completely useless. Fallout 76 did actually have stats that made sense, like T-60 being worse than T-51 in terms of ballistic resistance and better in terms of rad resistance, opposed to Fallout 4's version where all of the suits have the same rad resistance and T-60 was better than T-51 in all other ways. But now they've changed 76, so it's at the point where T-51 has worse ballistic resistance than the scrap metal Raider power armor. Its best stat is now cryo resistance, despite not being a winterized model. Every game after Fallout 2 just has nonsensical stats and should be ignored as gameplay balancing. However, the lore is also confusing sometimes, with a Fallout 4 loading screen calling the T-51 the pinnacle of pre-war protection, despite being inferior to the T-60 in-game. Then a loading screen in 76 calls T-60 the most advanced pre-war armor. With this sort of lore, the clandestine power armors can be reasonably excluded, this being any Enclave ones and the T-65. But in direct contention between the T-51 and T-60, it comes down to semantics. The T-51 should be the pinnacle of pre-war power armor, at least publicly used. The T-60, however, can still be the most advanced as it's a newer model, but inferior because it's cheaper. This is how power armor should work. Unfortunately, the games don't properly reflect this, so from this point on, I won't even bother mentioning the stats because they're all nonsense. Now we move on to the specific placement and usage of each model. Starting with the T-45, the first deployed model of power armor back in 2067, it serves the purpose it was designed for, but it suffers from being rushed into service to fight the Chinese invasion of Alaska. Surprisingly, we've still never seen this armor in California. But it should be noted, just in general, the protagonists of the games aren't sweeping every single square inch of the state the game takes place in. Even if we explore every single playable area, that's only a game representation of what the real world area would be. For example, we can pass the Sierra Army Depot hundreds of times without finding it because there's just so much open wastes. Only when we are told exactly where to find it, we can. So potentially there are T-45 suits in California, we just never personally find the bases or depots in the desert. But as to why we don't see them in the area we do travel, in Fallout 1 the only power armor we see belongs to the Brotherhood, which originated from the only military base in the game, Mariposa. Because the scientists at Mariposa were researching the forced evolutionary virus, originally a potential new plague cure, soon turned into a super soldier program, it shows how much the government valued this top secret research that they would give the soldiers protecting it power armor to match, not the old outdated T-45 suits or even regular combat armor, but feasibly the best equipment available. By Fallout 2 we explore more of California and see slightly more power armor. Once again, there's some suits at the Mariposa military base and with the Brotherhood, but now you can also buy some in San Francisco. This could potentially be from one of the bases in or around the city, but it could also be these suits were being shipped out overseas when the war occurred, and by that point there would be very few T-45 models still being shipped out. The last source of power armor in Fallout 2 is from the Enclave, but considering they are the remnants of the government that retreated to an offshore oil rig before the end of the world, it's no surprise they didn't take the most outdated power armor with them. Finally, we return to New California in the TV show, where we only see a small part of it. The only power armor we see is a few T-60s belonging to the Brotherhood, which just raises further questions. But in relation to the T-45, if they're not just being used elsewhere in the state by the Brotherhood, I just assume by this point, with how small the Brotherhood appears, that all their T-45s have been destroyed by years of war. We'll get further into that later. Overall, California seems to have very few power armor suits, at least very few that weren't atomized when it was bombed back to the Dark Ages. Moving on to Nevada, we actually see a few suits of T-45 around. The Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel, having travelled from New California, have a number of T-45 suits. They could have acquired these on their journey, or they may have been from somewhere else in California. It's quite possible that if these are the older T-45s, then the Brotherhood could have found a depot containing a lot of these as decommissioned suits. The NCR also has a few T-45s now, some of which could have been uncovered at old military sites, but most if not all of their salvaged suits are spoils of war from fighting the Brotherhood. Despite being due to development constraints that all NCR salvaged power armor is T-45, it makes sense that the Brotherhood soldiers in inferior older suits would be the ones the NCR can kill more of. The Mojave Brotherhood also has much less T-45 compared to their T-51. There's also a few other random places T-45 can be found in Nevada, likely because the area was spared from much of the nuclear warheads that were targeted at it. The Legion is probably the most curious case of possessing power armor. It's assumed that most of the power armor parts we see in their possession are from their battles against the Brotherhood of Steel further east. While some could definitely be scavenged from the wasteland, they do possess entirely too much to realistically be taking these off dead bodies of Brotherhood paladins. There's also now just the issue of size in relation to the new system of power armor. The single arm the Centurions wear works when power armor is depicted in the much slimmer human-sized form, but doesn't work when looking at Fallout 4 style power armor. It works with a salvaged power armor because you can still move in T-45 even without a fusion core, and the NCR mainly uses it for stationary guards. Even if it were the supposed smaller T-45, wearing the arm like that would be far too big to use effectively, and I think the answer is given when we see the Centurions in the TV show. Their T-45 armor is much smaller than the actual suit we see in the show. So I don't think it actually is T-45. More likely what the Centurions are wearing are T-45 Halloween costumes. It signifies their victory over Brotherhood soldiers in battle, but does not encumber them with the unwieldy weight of an actual T-45 arm. And we all know the Brotherhood they're fighting doesn't use T-45 anyway. Now with the DLCs. A lot of them don't have power armor in them, so I'm not going to put them on the map or mention them again. In the Sierra Madre and Zion Canyon, there's no specific reason for T-45 or any other power armor to be in these places, nor do they appear in them. They're not military installations, and they have no factions that would use power armor. They're isolated places originally intended just for leisure. Big Mountain technically does have some T-45, likely because they had an active military presence before the war, but none of it remains lying around. Despite being a military contractor, it seems designing power armor was left exclusively to Westech. Lonesome Road kind of takes place on the border of California and Nevada, so I'm just going to say it's Nevada. There's barely any power armor in Lonesome Road, which seems odd considering the military presence in the towns of Hopeville and Ashton. Now obviously a lot of the region was destroyed by the Great War and then later the detonation of unlaunched ICBMs, but the military forces in these towns would have mainly been silo staff and their security forces. Otherwise it's the same story as the rest of the West Coast. There's little power armor, and instead, the security forces here have access to state-of-the-art combat armor. Now, as to why we don't see the T-45 post-war in the show, frankly it opens the bigger question of why we don't see the Mojave Brotherhood of Steel. Oh, you want me to answer that? There was probably some war. I'll get into that later. The main reason, if no other, is that the main characters don't explore the Mojave in its entirety. In fact, I'm sure the Mojave Brotherhood is right there at Helios 1, just off screen. Still there, for 16 years. Let's move on to the East Coast, shall we? West Virginia, despite having an incredibly small military force in real life, has a considerable amount of leftover military equipment in Fallout 76. Partly it's because of the Enclave's plan for West Virginia post-war. This can be inferred from the existence of the congressional bunker and the missile silos, especially their level of automation. The same goes for the rest of Appalachia. Automation is absolutely everywhere, far more than any other state we've seen, not to mention all the vaults. Gold, plant seeds, animal DNA, it all comes together to create a region that would be able to be easily recolonized after a nuclear war. And what else would the Enclave want? Military power. The military convoys, the automated training facility, they were pooling military resources here before the war. The other reason would be Colonel Santiago's military remnant. After the war, Colonel Santiago led her soldiers from DC to West Virginia in hopes of finding the remaining government at the congressional bunker. This isn't some AWOL military unit either. They didn't get to West Virginia until years after the war. It's very likely that Colonel Santiago was in command of all remaining military forces in DC, and when they left they probably would have taken all of the equipment they could manage, including power armor. Of course, almost everyone in West Virginia, including all military forces, died or left for years, leaving any T-45 suits laying around waiting to be taken. The same does not apply to the parts of Ohio and Virginia we explore in 76. Rather, these places would just have any suits scavenged from military facilities. Especially in the case of Ohio, where there's a significant number of raider gangs, including one that specifically sought out power armor after the war. Atlantic City is easily explained as we pretty much just explore civilian tourist areas of the city with a very low military presence. There's not much reason for there to be any power armor here at all. Yeah, we'll get to that one. Pittsburgh, as it appears in Fallout 76 in the year 2105, is said to have manufactured power armor before the war, explaining its common appearance in the game. While there are likely complete suits still scattered around the city somewhere, all we see are the suits that have been worn down to junk by the crazed raiders of the city. And this segues well into Fallout 3's version of the pit in 2277, where the only power armor is a handful of T-45 suits. The reason for this being that the Brotherhood swept through the pit years prior, killing many of the hostile inhabitants. During this time, it would make sense the Brotherhood looted any power armor they could find in the pit, bringing it to the capital wasteland. It's possible they missed some T-45 or they were combat losses that got left behind, explaining why a few remain in the pit. Now this begs the question why we pretty much only see T-45 in Washington DC. Firstly, almost all of the armor salvaged from the pit would likely only be useful as spare parts, and apart from Colonel Santiago's unit likely taking the vast majority of power armor in the DC area after the war, if the Brotherhood does have any other suits in DC, they probably don't have the resources to maintain them. The West Coast can get away with fielding T-51 because they spend most most of their time in bunkers with hordes of equipment, but the Brotherhood in the capital is engaged in near constant conflict with the hostile creatures of the wasteland. Now, as to why there's so much T-45, the expeditionary force led by Owen Lyons to the east coast probably had some from the west coast or by the time they got to the pit. Given how much they seem to have in DC though, I think it's likely another instance of them finding a cache of old T-45 suits in storage. And again, these could possibly be the older versions as seen in the show. With Fallout 3's DLC, Mothership Zeta is an alien spaceship, so it's pretty understandable there's no power armor there. Point Lookout is rural Maryland with barely any military presence, so there's no power armor there either. Contrast to that, Alaska would be pretty much the hotspot for power armor considering the war there. We see T-45 in the TV show as it was deployed there, but we don't see it in the Operation Anchorage simulation. I rationalize this as the simulation being a propaganda piece, so it doesn't depict the older, flawed T-45s, instead showing off the newer, better suits. Moving on to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we see a great deal of T-45 just lying around. The explanation for all of this is pretty much just that the military by this point has a number of surplus outdated power armor suits that would have been supplied to National Guard units as civil cohesion began to crumble in pre-war America. It can also be seen in-game that many power armor suits were being transported around Boston before the bombs fell. It's possible they were being sent to Asia from Boston's port, however almost all of Fallout 4's power armor is level dependent on what exact model will spawn at any given location. As for Fallout 4's DLC, on the Mount Desert Island in Maine, there's no T-45. The only power armor there is because of a military collaboration with the soda company Vim. While the suits would have been under the jurisdiction of Marines from the island's naval base, Vim was able to use them for in-person marketing. Now, why waste scarce military resources on such a pointless venture? The only real way to rationalize it is as a recruitment scheme by the military, and for that they're not going to use their old outdated suits. As is the same case with Nuka World, power armor was used in collaboration with Nuka-Cola as a recruitment scheme. However, there are other suits scattered around that can spawn as any other model. We can see there was a military presence around the park before the war, and part of this would be military representatives working directly with Nuka-Cola. But some of the various suits scattered around Nuka World would also likely have been brought by people venturing to Nuka World in the decades after the war, with the power armor eventually left lying around as it outlasted its owners. And finally, we see T-45 in US-occupied Canada in the TV show. This suit was even used by a US Marine guarding an internment camp pre-war, likely before the T-51 was even developed, and a T-51 would likely be unnecessary for a prison guard when it's more needed on the front lines anyway. That should cover all T-45 retcons location-wise, but I want to quickly address the Fallout TV show Weld Retcon. While technically it's the T-60 shown to have this issue, it's said to have originally been an issue on the T-45. And frankly, this whole scene is just nonsense. So you mean to tell me that after this armor being in a wartime service for 10 years, you finally upgrade it, and once again, 10 years of conflict, you still have a way for the operator to get one shot from the front of the torso, despite the T-60 having a different design to the T-45. No, that's not how that works. Whether the show writers considered this or not is irrelevant. In universe, the ghoul is just lying here. He's trying to psych out the Brotherhood here. The actual way he can do this is because of his bullcrap gun. It's obviously using very rare, expensive ammo as it can pierce through a man's torso and still exit with enough velocity to explode the head of the man behind him and launch him a good 5 feet. So it's not hard to understand how it could penetrate power armor, as that would mainly be geared towards protecting against small arms like 5.56 or 7.62, not expensive gyrojet ammo that would never be used by regular infantry. Now on to T-51, Deployed in 2076, it can be considered the best publicly known power armor, a vast improvement over the T-45. Starting off at the very beginning, we see soldiers wearing T-51 keeping the peace in US-occupied Canada. It can be assumed these soldiers are seeing combat where T-45 should mostly have been phased out of active combat by now, and also these soldiers are appearing on TV, so they probably purposefully got the newer, better suits in frame for this. In California, as explored before, we see this there because of the Mariposa military base, a testing center for the forced evolutionary virus that was guarded by soldiers in the most advanced military power armor available. Some suits also appear in San Francisco, likely they were there being shipped off to the front lines when the war broke out, or perhaps even to an oil rig. As we see, the Enclave has quite a few T-51s. While the Enclave would have other suits in their possession, these would have seen very limited production before the war, so the alternative would be filling their ranks with the best mass-produced power armor pre-war. As to why we don't see T-51 used by the Brotherhood in 2296 in California, I think we have to accept the idea that the Brotherhood and the NCR destroyed each other following New Vegas. Needless to say, the creators of the show cared little for the ramifications it would have on the established world we already have. I don't see any other explanation for why the NCR and the Brotherhood have degenerated so much. The Brotherhood now filling its ranks with common wastelanders and having so few personnel and resources, aside from the airship which came out of nowhere. It is possible this is a splinter faction of the New California chapter, but either way, to get to this state of ruin, it seems after New Vegas, the NCR and Brotherhood renewed their conflict, to the point where much of their forces were lost to attrition, likely killing most of their senior military leadership as we don't see any paladins from the West Coast in the show. Consequently, this would also result in the loss of most of the Brotherhood's power armor, chief among their arsenal being the T-51. With Nevada, as it appears in New Vegas, nearly all T-51s belong to the Brotherhood, either being brought from New California or looted in Nevada. The only other ones we see are on the dead prospectors in the Deathclaw Promontory, who are more than likely Enclave soldiers that survived the vertibird crash, and then the T-51 that you can find in the Divide. It doesn't seem like any of the soldiers at Big Mountain were supplied with T-51. And as explained before with the T-45, none of the other New Vegas DLCs have power armor in them. So now we have Nevada in the TV show, which again doesn't explain where the hell the Mojave chapter is. There's a meeting between other chapters at Groom Lake, but no Mojave chapter, nor any T-51 at this gathering. It could be said that the Mojave chapter was wiped out in conflict with the NCR after New Vegas, but I still think they would have survived to a degree, along with the real New California chapter. These clowns we see at this meeting have to be some sort of Brotherhood outcast group. How else would the Commonwealth chapter be on the verge of losing? Unless he's just lying. But as to why we don't see any T-51, well, as far as I can tell, apart from Paladin Harkness, the only power armor we actually see in any of these scenes belongs to these New California outcasts, who only have T-60. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of T-51 just off screen. Moving on to West Virginia, as well as parts of Virginia and Ohio, the explanation stays the same as it was for the T-45. There was a large military remnant that came to West Virginia years after the war, but they're all dead now, leaving behind their power armor. The same with Ohio and Virginia. Their military forces have disbanded or died, leaving behind what power armor they had. Given Fallout 76 takes place nearly 2 centuries earlier than the other games on the East Coast, there would also be more power armor around, still yet to be destroyed by the following decades of human conflict in the wasteland. A side note here is also that we find a prototype T-51 modified by a steel company for industrial usage. This is one of many corporate power armor examples we have now. The pit in Fallout 76 doesn't appear to have any T-51. Whether T-51 was produced here is unknown, but by the time we explore it post-war, all the power armor here has been ravaged by years of Raider usage, leaving every suit to be repaired with scrap metal. As stated before in Fallout 3's pit, the Brotherhood had moved through there years prior, likely taking all power armor except for the T-45 suits left by dead knights. But this of course raises the question why the capital chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel only had T-45 and not T-51. Potentially they weren't given many T-51 suits for their expedition, but I think it's as simple as the fact that they crossed a post-nuclear America on foot. Paladin Romani of the Brotherhood Expeditionary Force in Fallout 76 remarks about the state of her T-51 after coming from Lost Hills.
Need to have Valdez take another look at my armor. 2,000 miles of hiking's put some real wear on it.
But that expedition was a single squad crossing the country 20 years after the apocalypse. The Lions expedition would have been a significantly larger presence, making the journey 150 years later. The amount of walking on broken roads and uneven terrain would already do its damage. The constant conflict from hostile humans and wildlife would do far more damage to their power armor. Without a permanent base to reorg and repair their equipment, most of their T-51 was probably beyond repair by the time they arrived in DC, and even then they likely still have some T-51 stored in their armory, but don't use it because it's just so much more complicated than the T-45. And considering how we see initiates with T-45, these ones being Wastelander volunteers not even born into the Brotherhood, it seems the Brotherhood may also have enough of a surplus of T-45s to not worry about servicing any other suits they do have. So what about the capital wasteland outside of the Brotherhood? Where's all that T-51? What wasn't taken by Colonel Santiago's military remnant or looted by the Brotherhood, there's only 2 remaining T-51 suits in DC. One securely locked under a military base, which almost certainly seems to be a special version of it, and one at a military training simulator, which is being actively plundered by the Brotherhood. This simulation shows the T-51 being used in Alaska, and there's no reason to believe that isn't true. The reason we don't see T-51 in Alaska in the show is because that scene would have taken place in the 10 years of the war prior to the deployment of the T-51. In Fallout 4 there can be quite a lot of T-51 actually. To reiterate, Boston appears to have been sending a lot of power armor overseas. Realistically, this mostly should have been T-51. Some elite military units may have been equipped with T-51 on the home front, but a lot of it would be going to the front lines overseas. In Far Harbor, the 2 T-51 suits are there just for recruitment propaganda. INQUIRE is the same with its own Yucca-Cola armor. Any other T-51 around the area seems to just be a coincidence that a military unit was moving through there pre-war, or that someone has brought one around here post-war and since died. Now the T-60. Deployed only months before the war and presumed to be a cheaper and more easily maintained suit than the T-51 while still being superior to the T-45. This one is quite complicated. Apart from the Fallout 4 intro, which is maybe Alaska, could also be China, the T-60 was originally relegated only to the East Coast, and as such was easier to justify that it only saw limited deployment on the East just before the war. But now with its appearance on the West Coast in the TV show, it upsets the notions we hold around power armor. It also makes explaining it quite a lot harder. I'll start with the East Coast first. We are told T-60 units were used for riot control, and we see them keeping the peace as the world is ending, so I believe it did see proper deployment on the East Coast. Apart from the military unit leaving DC and taking their power armor with them to West Virginia, all the East Coast areas with a military presence pre-war should have T-60. Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia, and Massachusetts, including INQUIRE. The exceptions firstly being Mount Desert Island, which I don't think had a large enough marine unit to warrant numerous suits, only the T-51s being there as part of a corporate deal. With the pit, the raid explanation stands, and we can actually see the remnants of the T-60 suits that the raiders have abused. As to why there's none in DC, it's likely they were all taken by the military forces that left DC after the war. Now this becomes a problem with Fallout 4. Massachusetts can have T-60 because by all accounts most suits have been untouched since the war. But when the Brotherhood shows up in the Commonwealth, they already have their entire force outfitted with T-60. It's possible they could have explored some other regions and discovered these suits. However, at this point I have to accept the idea that the T-60 is actually a modified T-45. As we see the T-60 pre-war, it would be the pre-war government and West Tech that achieved this. It's easy to see why. If they could take many of the older and much inferior T-45 suits, then retrofit them to at least eliminate the glaring issues, that would greatly increase the fighting capabilities of the forces in Asia. At this point in the war, it seems the government doesn't even think the T-45 itself is worth sending overseas. This means that the reason the Brotherhood had so many T-60s and no T-45 is because they discovered how these suits were upgraded pre-war and copied that process following the events of Fallout 3. It would certainly make it much more difficult if the T-45 Delta the Brotherhood had in DC was the older, smaller version seen in the show, but considering how many power armor frames they must have acquired elsewhere, especially the pit, it's plausible they could have modified their entire arsenal of T-45D over time, considering they weren't spending their time building the Pridwin as that has been retconned to be pre-war. Now that's all sorted for the East Coast, how do we have T-60 on the West Coast? As a general rule, I don't think the T-60 saw deployment in the West Coast. It's likely there were a few being sent overseas that never made it, so they could have found those, but they could also just have discovered how to upgrade their T-45s, and I reckon that's what we're seeing here. If these Brotherhood outcasts went to war with the NCR after New Vegas and lost most of their fighting force, it's easy to see why they only have a handful of suits left. And all these things considered, these T-60s may be salvaged from the remains of countless T-45 suits damaged in the conflict, at least partially explaining why the only power armor this Brotherhood chapter has is a few T-60s. There may also have been T-60 reinforcements from the Commonwealth, but then wouldn't these knights be loyal to the Commonwealth and not Quintus in his attempt at rebellion? Even still, the West Coast Brotherhood had to have discovered or upgraded some T-60s themselves, as we can see at least one in the immediate aftermath of Shady Sands' destruction. T-65. This power armor so far has only been seen in West Virginia, sourced from Vault 79. Vault 79 being where America's gold reserves were moved in secret shortly before the war, and where they remain under the protection of the United States Secret Service. Although T-65 is a military designation, its concept art originally showed it as Vault security armor, and the impression given from the suit, especially considering where it's found, is that of a very costly but limited production. Its design is also significantly more armored than any other models. This very well could be the most advanced pre-war power armor, except for perhaps its agility being hampered by all that bulk. So that's why we've only seen it in West Virginia, because it's probably so costly that it would only be guarding something as important as America's gold reserves. The EX-17 excavator. This corporate power armor was developed by Garahan Mining Co. in 2077 with the intent of being used as a mining suit. However, the rival mining company was able to tarnish the reputation of the project, and it was cancelled with only a few complete suits. Apart from the player presumably having one of these suits, the helmet can be seen being worn by a Brotherhood impersonator in a random encounter, who frankly has other pieces he shouldn't have. There's also one suit found in Ohio on a bounty hunt target. I wouldn't really consider that canon, but either way, both would have just been looted from Garahan, because this suit was only made in West Virginia as was made by a West Virginian mining company using Ultracite, an element only found in West Virginia. The X-01, a prototype Black Ops power armor model put into at least limited production before the war. For all intents and purposes, to the wasteland population, this armor does not exist. We only see this armor in two locations because the remnants of the government were operating there. Everywhere else, this armor either never existed or the only people to employ it have advanced beyond it. In West Virginia, we see the X-01 because of the Enclave bunker under the White Spring Resort. It's hinted this model may be an earlier version than the one we see in 4, furthered by the presence of the prototype paint on the armor when initially acquired. We can see parts of it have made it as far as Ohio on the Rust King, likely acquired when he escaped from the Enclave, and the previously mentioned Brotherhood impersonator, who must have looted a dead Enclave soldier somewhere. It's most likely that was a mistake by the developers and this character was just given a random assortment of armor pieces. Another mistake with the X-01 that I don't even want to put on the map is found on the power armored raiders in the pit in Fallout 76. You can see their raider power armor has a piece of X-01 on the leg. Obviously there isn't a standard issue raider armor design, it's just a representation, but if I had to give an in-universe explanation, I would say one of the factories in Pittsburgh secretly made X-01 parts for the government, and there was some left over after the war that were later utilized by the pit raiders. In Massachusetts, as with most power armor in Fallout 4, it's level dependent, so beyond a few examples there is simply some sort of presence of XO1 in the state. But what's strange here is that there's no real indication of the Enclave having been here. This is of course a lack of forethought on implementing it, but in universe it's easy to explain. If there were a Black Ops unit operating in the city, you probably wouldn't know until you somehow stumble on their remains, which also makes it hard to tell what they were doing, or when they were even here, being pre-war, immediate post-war, or perhaps a little later. In this instance, I believe these are the remains from the immediate post-war. In Fallout 4, there's only one case in the aftermath of the Great War of the military offering escort to scientists if they have vital military research, and I think this is probably what the Black Ops unit's mission boils down to. Not only if there were any potential Enclave members that needed extraction from Boston, but any other VIPs that could prove important, which, based on the presence of XO1 still in the city, some didn't finish their mission. This differs from, say, DC, because most VIPs should have been close enough to Raven Rock that Enclave operatives wouldn't get trapped and cut off like they did when going as far out as Boston, because this would have been before the Enclave understood the extent of the destruction caused by the war. As I've discussed before, the Enclave's plan was originally recolonization post-war, especially in West Virginia, but as always, plans fail. Loss of communication with West Virginia and their eventual death would throw a wrench in the works. Perhaps furthered by the loss of their operatives in extraction missions like Boston, the Enclave would clearly abandon this plan for centuries. As we are told, the government remnants on the East Coast, meaning at least Raven Rock, fled to the West Coast in the decades after the war. So this power armor essentially isn't in use anymore. Of course, we'll probably still see the Enclave use it in the show because it's Fallout 4 slop, but, well, anyway. Vulcan power armor. This is where the fatigue starts to set in, because this was originally an Atomic Shop skin based off Frank Horrigan, but Fallout 76's incessant need for new power armor meant it was implemented as a functioning suit in-game and therefore canon. This and the next few models also have such little lore surrounding them that we don't even know whether they're pre- or post-war productions. Vulcan power armor is only seen in West Virginia on one squad of Enclave soldiers that was sealed underground before the war. It's possible this is just heavily modified XO1, alternatively it was a competing design with the XO1 but was inferior and abandoned. This is a common practice for military equipment, a recent example being the US Army's Next Generation Squad Weapon program. While the M7 was the winner, there were other designs competing. If the Enclave had already built some prototype models of the Vulcan, they may have given these suits to Epsilon Squad because they were guarding scientists with extremely low possibility of hostile contact. Remember, they were sealed underground before the war. Or perhaps this is an even earlier iteration of the XO1 itself. Regardless, any advantages this armor may have are likely due to the Ultracite shielding that was being researched by the scientists being implemented on this armor. The Hellfire prototype. Not to be confused with the finished model. This power armor was delivered to Vault 51 in 2080 by the Enclave, at the behest of the Vault Zax unit. The only suit we see is in West Virginia on the Scorched Overseer. Side note, this armor is only accessible to the player as a skin. Fallout 76 does this quite often. I take this to mean that the armor is not very good, or at least has nothing special about it. Otherwise it would be its own in-game armor. This is furthered by the fact we don't see Hellfire for another few hundred years. So in this instance, the Hellfire was another prototype the Enclave had, and it just so happens the Zax unit in West Virginia wanted one for its Overseer assessment, also known as Nuclear Winter. Otherwise this power armor would only be found in deep storage in Enclave bases. Vault 63 power armor. Again, this power armor is only used by NPCs or as a skin by the player. Found only in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, originally coming out of Vault 63, which technically does span into West Virginia, Vault 63 being the personal project of a very wealthy Vault Tech higher-up Hugo Stultz. 63 as a whole is outfitted with a range of exclusive equipment, so I think the explanation here is that Stultz had a significant amount of military equipment made for Vault 63, and while the frames may have been acquired from Westech, he used the same contractor that made the other gear for 63 to make custom power armor for his vault. Civic Duty power armor. Only one suit is seen worn by Buttercup in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 2105. Yet again, there's no explanation for this one. But given its tactical-esque helmet, color scheme, and Vault-Tec logo on the chest, I think it's actually an adaptation of the Vault Security power armor concept from the T-65. I also think this gold part of the torso of the suit may be a water cannon, and the suit could attach a hose to the back. The best explanation I have for this, again considering it doesn't have unique stats, this was probably just a concept suit that was at a military arms expo, and Buttercup looted it from there. Alternatively, some of the cover art shows this armor next to a crashed vertibird, so maybe it came from somewhere else. And yes, this art is probably meant to represent us players, but our vertibird never crashes, so make of that what you will. Hellcat power armor. The only known suit was seen being used by the Hellcat mercenaries in West Virginia in 2105. Once again, it's unclear when or where this armor comes from. There's a very small possibility this armor was created in the pit, as the Hellcat mercenaries previously had a presence there, and the city manufactured power armor before the war. But it's more likely the armor itself was made before the war. It's likely it was either tank killer armor, with its increased level of plating in the upper torso, what could be a trophy system on the chest, and the mention of mechanized Hellcats fighting in China at the start of Fallout 4. Alternatively, it could be submersible marine armor, the trophy system instead being motion sensors, the massive breathing tubes being obvious, and the fact of the Hellcat company's motto being Mors ex Mare, translating to death from the sea. As to why we don't see it anywhere else, it's possible that because of this armor's combat role, the military didn't see value in having it stateside for defense of the country, or we take the easy route and say this is just another prototype. Union power armor. In-game, we actually only see this suit used by the player, but we have to assume it was actually built and used at some point by the people it gets its name from. Before the war, the Union was a local labor union in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After the end of the war, they would continue their industrial work. With the presence of the power armor factories in the city and the growing threat of fanatic raiders, it's simple to explain this as post-war power armor made with industrial steel. Raider power armor. This one doesn't really have any lore around it, but it doesn't need to either. Raider power armor is just an umbrella term for any power armor that has been repaired with or made out of salvage. The in-game depiction doesn't do justice to the fact it's not a single design, but rather each suit would be unique and handmade. We don't see this type of armor on the West Coast because almost all of the power armor there is controlled by large factions that most certainly are not raiders and have the capability to, at least, uniformly maintain their armor. Anyone outside of these factions doesn't use it for raiding, probably because anyone who did was swiftly hunted down by the Brotherhood of Steel. Pretty much every East Coast location we see that has power armor has Raider power armor as well, with the exception being Maine, where no Raiders have found a few suits of power armor, and DC, where the Brotherhood has also got control of almost all power armor. Everywhere else on the East Coast we can see Raider power armor. Even places like the Pit in Fallout 76 have Fanatic power armor, which is also just Raider armor. And then the Pit's appearance in Fallout 3, the tribal armor, while still recognizable as T-45, does fit the bill to be considered Raider power armor. Ultracite power armor. This armor is very simple. It's just a T-51 suit heavily modified by the West Virginian Brotherhood of Steel, with a little help from the California chapter. Its only appearance is in West Virginia because the special ore, Ultracite, used in its construction is only found in West Virginia. It has a notable variant being Strangleheart power armor, which is a suit that has been covered in mutated vines. Communist power armor. Now usually I'm very clear on canon in Fallout, no matter how bad it's gotten, but Fallout 76 often blurs the line. Originally the communist power armor was just a skin in the atomic shop. Okay, not canon. Simple. But then it was added onto the boss enemy for the communist faction in Daily Ops. So technically it is on an NPC in the game, but anyone who's played Daily Ops would understand they don't really make sense. I don't consider this communist armor to be canon, but if for some reason it is, it would only make sense if it was modified American power armor. If the Chinese did have power armor, they wouldn't be smuggling it into rural America. And even if for some reason they did, then we would have seen the communist agents in the main story using it. Now moving decades into the future, we have the Advanced Power Armor, or APA, what we can only assume to be the finished version of X-01. According to the not quite canon Fallout Bible, this armor was developed on Control Station Enclave in the early 23rd century. We only see this armor twice throughout the series. In California, because that's where the Enclave was operating around in the 2240s, and then in Nevada, because some remnants of the Enclave fled there following the destruction of the oil rig and later the fall of Camp Navarro. We don't see this armor anywhere else because the Enclave either doesn't have a presence there, has advanced past the APA in the power armor they use, or hasn't even developed it yet. The Advanced Power Armor Mark II as it appears on the oil rig in Fallout 2, not to be confused with the APA Mark II from Fallout 3. We don't know for certain whether these are two different suits. I would say they are, simply because the one in Fallout 2 uses the same sprite as the Mark I. Now here's where we get into an insane level of semantics. The Mark II mentioned previously in the game when Sergeant Dornan asks why you don't have the Mark II powered combat armor, as well as in the Fallout Bible stating in 2220 October, Enclave scientists develop a reliable version of the Mark II power armor. But with context, these instances are actually referring to the APA Mark I, not the Mark II. Because remember, this was back when the T-51B was the only other power armor in the lore. So in that scenario, the original APA is the Mark II, or simply second model of power armor after the first, being the T-51. There's a difference in language here, because the original APA is the Mark II of power armor in general, while the APA Mark II is the Mark II in the Advanced series of power armor. Now with that current lore, it changes, because T-51 isn't the only pre-war power armor, so in this case, factoring in the new lore, all of these pre-war military models would be considered Mark I power armor, and potentially all post-war models manufactured by the Enclave are considered Mark II power armor, or there's some significant level of advancement in the technology that not only are new designs considered different models, but considered to be in a completely different class compared to the pre-war designs. Most likely the APA doesn't use the old power armor frame system. In conclusion, the APA Mark II, as seen on the oil rig, is not mentioned anywhere else other than its physical appearance. My theory is this suit was a new improvement over the original APA, but all of the existing Mark IIs were destroyed along with the rig, or taken by the Chosen One, so the surviving Enclave would likely not have access to this technology. Advanced Power Armor Mark II, the one we all know and love from Fallout 3. This, as far as we know, was manufactured after the destruction of the oil rig and employed by the remnants of the US government in Washington DC. There's not much to say about this armor. Assuming it is indeed different from the one seen in Fallout 2, it's the most recently made power armor in the timeline, and apart from the remnants in New Vegas, the Fallout 3 Enclave is the most recent we've seen the Enclave chronologically. Now here's where I have to address the elephant in the room, the Creation Club Enclave in Fallout 4. Because this now comes with Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition, some of you may think it legitimizes it. It's still just a mod, like the horse armor and the Doom shotgun. There is no XO2, it's called Advanced Power Armor Mark II. It also wouldn't be using a frame. You can see the exoskeleton on the outside of the legs. Hellfire Power Armor, the final completion of a centuries-old design. The Enclave in DC was limited in the number of Hellfire suits they could deploy. It's never explained what exactly the suit's key component Duraframe is, but that is likely what makes it superior to the APA Mark II and what makes it so limited in production. As the Enclave in DC are the only ones we've seen to have finished the Hellfire design, DC is the only place we encounter this model of power armor, and what I already said about the XO2 in Fallout 4 applies to the Hellfire armor in Fallout 4 as well. Not canon. And that does it for all the different power armor retcons we have throughout the series. Is what I would say if we didn't have one more. Mid West. Power armor. Wait a minute. You agreed on Canon ones!
I lied.
Only seen used by the Midwestern Brotherhood of Steel around 2197, and a big departure from the other power armor designs we've seen, when the Midwest Brotherhood left California, they would have taken some of their T-51 with them, but the subsequent decimation they faced on their journey would likely have damaged their armor and materials they had with them for the repair of the armor. Now left with few and damaged power armor, what could they do? It seems there's no standard military power armor present in the Midwest, but there is a vast number of government bunkers dotting the landscape, and I believe this is where their power armor comes from. A secret government initiative to set up bunkers and depots across the heartland of America for use in the event of nuclear war. Stocked with power armor and vehicles designed to traverse the ruined world that would follow, I do believe this armor was designed for the post-war world, as I don't reckon the Midwest Brotherhood could operate the way they do, to the extent they do, if this armor wasn't specifically designed to be continuously used in a harsh environment such as a post-nuclear wasteland. Potentially it could have been constructed by the Brotherhood from other models of armor, however this Brotherhood definitely seems more militantly rugged than the isolationist nerds in the other chapters. This armor definitely seems more like a nuclear contingency by the government, perhaps even a separate faction of it to the Enclave. This armor almost certainly isn't made by anyone that made other models, least of all Westech. But I guess we'll see when they release the next Tactics game in 2198.